Welcome back to Giant Monster Games. My name's Ted, and this week we're taking a look at a deck I like to call Slumbering Spirits. Okay, let's get started. First off, let's take a look at the win conditions of the deck. Slumbering Tora and Mindshrieker. Now, Slumbering Tora is an artifact from way back in the Kamigawa block that I hardly doubt anybody even remembers. And Tora's ability says that we can pay 2, discard a spirit or arcane card from our hand, and it becomes a creature with power and toughness of X, where X is the discarded card's converted mana cost. So for example, we can just pay 2, discard a spirit card with like a converted mana cost of 8, and Tora becomes an 8/8 until end of turn. Pretty awesome. And now the other card is Mindshrieker. It's a card from Innistrad that honestly I didn't even know existed before I did research on this topic. And Mindshrieker says that we can pay 2, mill the top card of a target player's library, and Mindshrieker gets +X/+X, where X is the milled card's converted mana cost. So for example, we mill an 8-drop, Mindshrieker gets +8/+8 until end of turn. Pretty awesome because it has evasion too, so it can fly right over top a lot of creatures, sneaking in a lot of damage. Now this ability can be used to mill and disrupt our opponent, however most of the time we're just going to use it on us. It's a better idea. Our deck is built around these cards. Okay, now that we know how our win condition works, let's take a look at the creature package that supports it. First up is Sekki Season's Guide. We're running 3 copies of Sekki, and honestly the only thing we care about from this card is that it is 1, a spirit, and 2, has a high converted mana cost of 8. We aren't running green in the deck, so we will never ever cast him. Next up is 4 copies of Body of Jukai, which, just the same as the previous card, it's a spirit with high converted mana cost that we will never be able to cast. And lastly, we're running 4 copies of Iname as 1. I have no idea if I'm saying any of these names because they're from the Japanese block and I'm just clueless. And this again is a spirit that we will never be able to cast, but it has an insane converted mana cost of 12. So if we discard this card to our Tora, it's a 12/12 until end of turn. And likewise, if we mill this with Mindshrieker, we'll have a flying 13/13 Mindshrieker that's just going to be insane. You may at this point be thinking, Ted, this is a really janky deck. You have to make sure you have all the pieces in your hand or exactly on top of your library to get this to even work. And you know what? You're absolutely right. But let me show you the spell package, and I think that will clear everything right up. So let's move on to our spell package. Okay, first up we're running 4 copies of Serum Visions, absolutely one of the best cantrips in the entire Modern format. It allows us to scry, and that allows us to fix our next few draws to make sure that we're getting the right amount of lands in our deck on turn 1 if we're playing this, or we can get into our combo pieces. It's just very versatile and very helpful to the deck. Next up are 4 copies of Mystic Speculation. This card is similar to Serum Visions in that it allows us to scry, but this card allows us to scry 3, basically rigging the next 3 draw steps. One thing that you'll learn about this deck is to take your time and plan out your moves. So if you know that you're going to play a Mindshrieker this turn, for example, you know that you'll have to wait because of its summoning sickness. So instead of putting a huge spirit on the top of your library, put it 1 from the top. So that way you can untap, draw the card that you needed, and now your spirit's on the top. Also, your spirit's now able to attack, and you can mill it, so you can swing in for huge damage. Mystic Speculation also has the ability of buyback, and if you don't have any other place for the turn, go ahead and use it, so that way you can have Mystic Speculation back in your hand after it resolves, and you can use it again at another time. Next up is 4 copies of Noxious Revival. Noxious Revival acts as a catch-all for the deck. We can use it to get back a Tora or a Shrieker that's been removed, we can use it to get a spirit that we have discarded to our Tora, or we can use it to double mill from our Shrieker. So for example, if we just milled the Iname as 1, we can pay 2 life, get that Iname as 1 back on top of our library, mill it again with our Shrieker, and our Shrieker is now a flying 25/25 until end of turn. And let me tell you, first of all, things get crazy with this deck. So if it comes to it, we can use it to fetch out any of our deck's filtering spells on the fly. It's just all around very versatile, very useful card. Next up are 3 copies of Contingency Plan and 3 copies of Taigam Scheming. These cards, word for word, do the exact same thing. They allow us to look at the top 5 of our library, putting whatever we don't need into our graveyard, and the rest in any order on top of our library. So we can essentially rig our next few draws, along with the possibility of pitching a game-winning spirit into our graveyard that we need, so we can fetch it back up with Noxious Revival. Next, we're running 2 copies of Slip Through Space. As you know, the Tora doesn't have flying, it doesn't have trample, it doesn't have menace, which means we are highly susceptible to being chump block. And at the staggering cost of discarding a card for every attack, costs can add up really quickly and we might run out of fuel, when all we need is just 1 or 2 good swings. With Slip Through Space, we can make our Tora unblockable, and it also replaces itself in our hand, so we can get in that key damage. And lastly, we're running a single copy of Nourishing Shoal. Nourishing Shoal is the biggest reason why we're running green spirits only in our deck. It says that we can pay 2 an X and gain X life. Or, what we're really interested in, is that it says we can exile a green card instead of paying for it. We can gain X life, where X is the green card that we just exiled's converted mana cost. So for example, we can exile an Iname as 1 and gain 12 life at the cost of 2 cards at instant speed. Let's take a look at our lands. For our lands, we're running 3 Ghost Quarters. It's a great main deck way to fight against Tron, Manlands, and recently Eldrazi. It's a really good way to get rid of Eldrazi Temple, which is one of their best lands in their deck. It's just really helpful for us to stay alive in those kind of matchups. Then we're running 17 islands, completely free lands that provide all of our blue mana needs. Moving on to the sideboard. Firstly, we're running 2 copies of Slip Through Space, which is great against creature heavy or token matchups, and we can get in our damage as frequently as possible. Next, we're running 2 copies of Dispel. Dispel is primarily used to stop control decks. Then we're running 2 copies of Echoing Truth. This allows us to bounce tokens. It also allows us to remove something that is just way too oppressive on our deck, kinda like Leyline of the Void. Then we're running 2 copies of Mana Leak. Mana Leak is again just for control heavy matchups. Then we're also running 2 copies of Spreading Seas to help take care of Tron and slow combo decks down a bit. We're running 2 copies of Sun Droplet, which is fantastic against burn. Then we're running 2 copies of Tormod's Crypt, primarily as a way to stop graveyard synergies from our opponent. And lastly, we're running a single copy of Vapor Snag, which is great to get rid of the blocker that would just stop us from getting in lethal. Let's take a look at some upgrades. First and foremost, I'd like to recommend that we go blue-black with the upgrade path of this deck, and with that, we're going to have to upgrade our mana base. So firstly, I'd like to recommend 4 copies of Darkslick Shore, because we're going to want that mana available to us in both colors as soon as possible. Next, I'd like to recommend that we run 4 copies of Polluted Delta, and 2 copies of Flooded Strand to fetch out the lands that we're going to need, 2 copies of Watery Grave, and we're also going to want a single island. And as backup to all that, just as a way to fight against Tron, Manlands, and Eldrazi, just as mentioned in the main deck, we're going to run 3 copies of Ghost Quarter for the upgraded mana base. Now that we've upgraded our mana base, let's upgrade some of our creatures. Firstly, I'd like to recommend that we swap our Bodies of Jukai for 4 Myojins of Life's Web. Now the reason we're doing this is going to be obvious in just a second. I'm recommending the change to blue-black because we're going to run 4 copies of Goryo's Vengeance. It adds another win condition to the deck, it gives us more use out of our graveyard, and the reason we swapped out the Body of Jukai is because Goryo's Vengeance only hits legendary creatures. Now, all of our spirits in our deck are legendary, and they're all eligible to be hit by Goryo's Vengeance. Going blue-black also provides us the options to upgrade some things in our sideboard. So let's take a look at those sideboard upgrades. First up, we have 2 copies of Surgical Extraction. It's a great way to get rid of cards from an opponent's deck, possibly even a win condition. Next up, we have 2 copies of Leyline of the Void, fantastic for graveyard disruption. Then we have 2 copies of Fatal Push, one of the best removal spells in the entire format, and it's now turned on by our fetch lands. And lastly, for the upgraded sideboard, we have 2 copies of Nourishing Shoal. One of the best things we can do in a matchup against like Burn is to gain life, because they're going to run out of fuel and it helps keeps us alive. I kept it in the main deck simply to show what it could do. The only reason it wasn't in the original sideboard was because of budgetary reasons. It's definitely worth running this in place of things like Sun Droplet, I feel like, because it's just surprise life gain. It works on theme with our deck, and worst case scenario we can discard it to Tora.
And that's the entire deck tech. If you enjoyed the video, consider sharing it, vote for the next video, pound the like button, and subscribe to Giant Monster Games. I'm Ted, and until next time, don't forget to game like a giant monster!